to your success wasn't all about what you say and what you do, but how you carry yourself. Today I want to talk about the art of taking up space and how it can have a strong impact on the impressions that others have of you. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. In the space of personal branding, there can often be a lot of cliches about having a strong voice, raising your voice, or increasing your visibility. But what if you aren't just interested in talking more or being seen more, but actually having your presence felt? That is where the idea of taking up space and how you hold your body becomes really important. It forms a really essential part of your communication and how you are perceived by others. And as the communication pie tells us, only 7% of communication is related to words. 38% is related to your tone and 55% is related to your non-verbal communication. That means a total 93% of communication is said to have actually nothing to do with the words that you're using at all. So instead of just relying on the advice to have a strong voice to increase your personal brand, think about the tiny techniques that can have a big impact on your interactions. My first tip is to take up space in meetings. So by now you might have seen the incredibly viral TED Talk by Amy Cuddy where she talks about body language. This got everyone talking in particular about the power of power poses. So Amy Cuddy describes how even just a couple of minutes of power poses can trigger your brain into believing that you have the confidence that is expressed through that pose. So for example, if you have your hands up in the air for a few minutes, if you take up space in a room before you go into an interview, then your body is going to be triggered by that sensation that you had when you were taking up space. But the only thing that I have found since I first watched this video is that it's one thing to understand the potential of power poses, and it's another to actually find the time in your day, even for a couple of minutes, to be able to power pose before you head into an important meeting. A lot of us are going to meetings back to back, sometimes in really busy office environments. I know that's what I was doing when I was in the corporate environment. It was just meeting after meeting with hardly any time at all to take a break, let alone to be power posing in the bathroom as a quick pit stop before heading into those meetings. So what I personally feel could work better is to not just aim to power pose before you go into a meeting, but to think about how you are presenting yourself when you are actually in that meeting. Now, I spoke recently in my episode about posture, about how you hold yourself and sitting up straight, having your shoulders back, for example, being body language that communicates confidence. But it's also body language that takes up space because you're not so contracted in how you are presenting yourself. So instead of trying to power pose to trigger your brain, to trick your brain ahead of your meetings, just remind yourself, if you can, that this is something that you can try in the meetings itself. So take up a little bit more space than what might normally come naturally to you. And this isn't about invading other people's space. It's about just making yourself feel a little bit bigger in that conversation. Because if you have earned a seat at the table, then your body should be presenting as though you know that you belong at that table. My tip number 2 to take up space is to use your hands to communicate with intention. Now, the idea of hand gestures is something that is often considered co-speech gestures. It is a tool to help the person that you are speaking to process what it is that you are saying. This is if it is done with intention and it is done well, instead of being done erratically and potentially be seen as a distraction. If you are using your hand gestures well, this can help the person that you are communicating with actually process the messages that you are saying. It acts as almost a storytelling tool that aids in their comprehension and their recall in that communication. But using hand gestures also means being comfortable taking up space in a conversation. So, again, it's not just completely contracting to yourself and feeling really small in that conversation, like you don't have that space around you to move within. Now, my tip number 3 to take up space is to engage your sticky eyes. Now, this was one of my favorite tips from a book that I have talked about on this channel before that I absolutely loved, which you would have heard me mention in several episodes, and that is Lanuage's book, How to Talk to Anyone. This was one of my favorite tips from this book because I loved the way that it was packaged. It makes it very memorable. And it's the idea of sticky eyes almost being like this toffee that sticks to the person that is speaking. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't about just your generic advice to have strong eye contact. This is about having sticky eyes that sticks to the person that is communicating and then holding that gaze for a little bit longer than what might normally come naturally to you after that person stops speaking. So instead of just shifting your eyes straight away to the next person that is speaking in the room or jumping to the next thing that you want to add to that conversation, so you actually hold space in that conversation to make the person that you are speaking to feel seen and heard in that conversation. By just those tiny details of having confident eye contact, you are creating more space in that conversation and you're having a positive effect on the person that you are communicating with. There is research that supports that a heartfelt gaze has a physiological positive response in the person that is experiencing it. My tip number 4 is to command the stage. Now, this is something that I started thinking about a lot when I started to do more public speaking related to personal branding and also a lot of public speaking when I was the president of my MBA alumni network. And unfortunately, this is not something that I was thinking about a lot when I worked in the corporate world in marketing and communications and was constantly giving presentations to people. I wasn't actually thinking about the space that I was taking up in a stage, for example. I was thinking much more about what I was saying, about the presentation that I had created, about how the audience might react or what it was that they needed to hear as a part of what I was communicating. The one thing that I was not thinking enough about was how I was actually carrying my body and using the space around me. Now, I think often when you don't love public speaking, especially, you find yourself feeling really grounded in this one spot because you're not confident in owning that space. But what I found is that when you move around the space with intention, not erratically, it can actually help to calm those nerves because you're not just grounded in this one spot with all of those nerves just running through you and nowhere to go. And I know that that could potentially be different for everyone. But what I have found importantly is that it makes me a lot more intentional about how I am connecting with an audience and how I am connecting my body movements to what I am saying. So imagine going back to your high school drama. How are you actually using those different spaces with intention, connecting with the people in the left side of the room, in the right side of the room, through the middle of the room, for example. And there's also different ways that you can move to match what it is that you are saying. So for example, if you are making a point, you might move further into your audience to emphasize that point that you have communicated, to really let that resonate with your audience. But if you are asking a question, for example, you might move back and allow the audience to process what it is that you have asked them. So how are you using that space with intention? How are you confidently taking up space, but also connecting with your audience on a deeper level? My tip number 5 is to pause. Now, this is something that you will hear a lot of people recommend in the public speaking space, but maybe isn't something that you think about a lot in your day-to-day conversations. Now, the reason that I want to talk about the power of pausing in today's conversation is because that is having the confidence to take up space in a conversation. You understand that by pausing, your words have value in that conversation. You're not having to rush to the next thing that you want to say. You understand that you can pause and create more space in that conversation, because not every silence needs to be filled with your words. And by actually pausing, whether it is in your presentations or in your conversation, you're actually doing the person that you are communicating with, or the audience that you are communicating with, a favor, because you are allowing them to process what it is that you are saying. You're giving them the space to do that before simply moving on to whatever your next point is. My next tip is to expand your presence in your profile photos. Now, this might apply to your profile photos on, say, your LinkedIn account or maybe your other social media accounts. This could relate to the photos that you might have on your personal brand website. Maybe it is the images that you have on your video thumbnails, or maybe it is your podcast branding. But how can you, when you are taking those photos, take up just a little bit more space than what might come naturally to you? And the reason why I say this is that you might have heard, for example, that there is a saying that the camera adds 10 pounds. Now, what I have found personally is that when I am trying to take up more space in an image, or in, say, a video, for example, so that I don't appear so small and so contracted or uncertain, it actually always looks more contracted than what I feel I was at the time. So I might feel like I am taking up all of this space, seeming super confident, but every time I see those videos or I see those photos, it actually looks much smaller than what it was in my mind. So that is where I say, when you are taking those photos, try and actually push that boundary to what feels comfortable. As another example, I always remember from my experience working in marketing and communications and recording radio commercials, that the radio heads used to tell the talent that we were working with to project themselves about 10 times bigger than what actually felt natural to them. Because the majority of what seemed really over the top in communication was actually lost in that process, in that end result. So by projecting yourself almost 10 times bigger, you probably will land to more of that result that you are looking for in terms of taking up space and appearing more confident, even if it doesn't come naturally to you. Thanks so much. For more on all things personal branding, subscribe for more like this, and I'll see you in the next episode.